Did you know that one of the most famous musical themes in movie history was played by a man who had never composed a film score before? And he learned the instrument almost entirely by himself? That haunting, spinning melody you hear the moment the third man begins, that zither sound that seems to dance and disappear at the same time, came from a street musician who almost didn't get the job at all. It pulls you in. It makes you feel like something mysterious is just around the corner. And that feeling never really leaves. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about the third man. Number 20. A city in ruins became the real star. When director Carol Reed arrived in Vienna, Austria in 1948 to begin filming The Third Man, he did not find a beautiful European city waiting for him. He found broken streets, burned buildings, crumbling archways, and shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. World War II had ended just a few years earlier, and Vienna still carried its wounds like open scars. Walls were blackened, streets were cracked, and entire neighborhoods looked like they had simply given up on standing straight. Most directors might have looked at this destruction and felt discouraged. Carol Reed looked at it and felt something completely different. He felt inspired. Reed made a bold decision very early on. He would not rebuild Vienna for the camera. He would not use studio sets or fake backdrops painted to look like pretty European streets. Instead, he would use the real city, broken, dark, and bruised, exactly as it was. The ruins of Vienna would not just be a setting. They would become a character. They would breathe on screen. They would press against the actors and make the story feel heavier, colder, and more dangerous than any script could do alone. The production team walked through bombed-out alleys and half-collapsed doorways, finding locations that looked almost too strange to be real. Long staircases descended into darkness. Bridges crossed rivers in the dead of night. Old buildings leaned at odd angles as though they were listening to conversations they were not supposed to hear. Every location had a personality. Every shadow told a part of the story. And because these places were real, because real people had suffered in them, there was an emotional truth behind every single frame that no studio in Hollywood could have manufactured. The city was not just a backdrop. It was a confession. And Reed understood that completely. What looked like destruction on the street became pure cinema on the screen. Number 19. Orson Welles arrived late and changed everything. Orson Welles was supposed to be in Vienna much earlier. The production schedule had a clear plan. The cast would arrive, the filming would begin, and everyone would work together toward the same goal. But Orson Welles had other ideas. He showed up weeks late, gave almost no explanation that satisfied the crew, and arrived in Vienna like a storm that nobody had quite prepared for. Some people on set were frustrated, others were simply baffled. And then Orson Welles stood in front of the camera, and everyone forgot their frustration immediately. Welles played Harry Lime, a charming, brilliant, deeply corrupt man who had been selling watered-down penicillin on the black market, causing the deaths of innocent children. It was a villain's role, but Welles brought something to Harry Lime that made him terrifying in a very specific way. He made him likable. When Harry Lime smiled, you almost wanted to smile back, even though you knew exactly what kind of man he was. That contradiction between charm and evil is what made the character unforgettable. But here is the truly strange part. Orson Welles appears on screen for less than 20 minutes in a film that runs almost 100 minutes. He has very little screen time, and yet, when people talk about the third man today, the first name they say is Orson Welles. The first image they picture is his face appearing in a darkened doorway with that half-guilty, half-amused grin. His presence filled the entire movie, even when he was nowhere to be seen. Carol Reed used this absence brilliantly. He built the audience's expectation for Welles across the first half of the film, letting other characters talk about Harry Lime, describe him, miss him, mourn him, so that by the time Welles finally appeared, the whole cinema leaned forward at once, late to set, but right on time for legend. That wasn't just acting, it was pure, magnetic, screen-stealing power. Number 18. The Zither Man. Nobody expected, before filming began, producer Alexander Korda had a very specific idea about the music for the third man. He imagined a full orchestral score, strings, brass, the kind of grand, sweeping music that serious films used in those days. He hired composers. He discussed arrangements. He had a vision. And then Carol Reed went to Vienna and heard something that changed everything in a single afternoon. Reed was walking through a Vienna cafe when he heard a man playing a zither, a flat-stringed instrument with a bright, plucking sound that is very common in Austrian folk music. The man's name was Anton Ferris. He was not famous. He had no film credits. He had never written music for cinema in his life. He was simply a local musician playing for cafe customers, earning tips, going home. But the music coming from his fingers was something Reed had never quite heard before. It was lively and melancholy at the same time. It spun in circles. It felt like Vienna itself, beautiful on the surface, hiding something darker underneath. Reed sat down at that cafe. He listened for a long time, and then he made a decision that shocked his producers back in London. He would use Anton Ferris and his zither for the entire film score. No orchestra, no string section, just one man and one unusual instrument. Ferris was brought to London, given a room to stay in, and spent weeks recording the music at Reed's home. The result was the famous Harry Lime theme, which became one of the best-known pieces of music in cinema history. It reached number 1 on music charts in Britain. People who had never seen the film were humming it on buses and in markets. Anton Ferris, the cafe musician nobody had heard of, became an international sensation overnight. One quiet afternoon in a cafe changed movie history forever. What looked like a small accidental discovery turned out to be one of the greatest musical choices ever made on film. Number 17. The tilted camera that made critics argue. If you watch The Third Man carefully, you will notice something unusual about many of the shots. The camera is not straight. It tilts. It leans. Buildings appear at odd angles. Streets seem to run slightly diagonal across the frame. Characters are filmed from below, from above, from the side, almost never in the comfortable, balanced way that audiences in 1949 were used to seeing. This visual style has a name. It is called Dutch angle, or canted framing, and it made some very important people very uncomfortable. Graham Greene, who wrote the original screenplay for The Third Man, was one of those people. He reportedly told Carol Reed that the tilted camera was a mistake. He felt it was unnecessary, even silly, a visual trick that distracted from the story rather than supporting it. Several critics at the time agreed. They called it pretentious. They said Reed was being clever for the sake of being clever, leaning the camera because he could, not because he should. But Reed refused to change his approach. He believed deeply and firmly that the tilted angles were not decorative. They were emotional. A world where corruption runs underneath the surface of everyday life is a world that is not quite right. It should not look balanced. It should not feel comfortable. The camera tilt was a visual translation of moral unease. When Harry Lime operated in the shadows, the whole frame leaned with him. History proved Reed correct. Today, the visual style of The Third Man is considered one of the most influential in cinema history. Film students study those tilted angles in classrooms around the world. What critics once called a mistake is now called a masterpiece of visual storytelling. What looked like a distraction turned out to be the whole point. Number 16. Graham Greene wrote the story on the back of an envelope. The story that became The Third Man started as barely more than a sentence. Graham Greene, one of Britain's most celebrated novelists, was working with producer Alexander Korda on a different project when Korda asked him if he had any ideas for a Vienna set thriller. Greene reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. On the back of it, he had written a single sentence, a note to himself, a fragment of an idea he had been carrying around. That sentence described a man who attends his friend's funeral only to see that same friend watching from the crowd. That image, a dead man who is not dead, watching his own burial, became the seed of the entire story. Greene expanded it into a short novel first, then turned that novel into the screenplay. But he never forgot that it started as a single line on a scrap of paper tucked in a coat pocket. He wrote quickly with confidence because the image was so strong and so strange that the story almost built itself around it. Greene later said that writing The Third Man was one of the more unusual experiences of his career. He had to think of the story in visual terms rather than literary ones, not describing how a character felt, but showing where that character stood, what light fell on their face, what door they walked through. It was a different kind of writing, colder, more precise, like drawing with words rather than painting with them. The finished screenplay is still studied in film schools today as a model of how to write dialogue that feels real without being ordinary. Every line has a second meaning. Every conversation hides a secret. One small idea on the back of an envelope grew into one of the greatest screenplays ever written. Number 15, the sewers were real and absolutely terrifying. The climax of The Third Man takes place in the sewers beneath Vienna, and when you watch it, the water rushing through dark tunnels, the shadows chasing shadows, the echoing footsteps, you might assume some of it was built in a studio. A movie this precise about its atmosphere must have cheated somewhere, right? Actually, no. Those sewers were real. Every drop of water, every dripping wall, every suffocating tunnel. All of it was the actual sewer system beneath the city of Vienna. And filming inside it was one of the hardest, most unpleasant experiences the entire cast and crew endured. The sewer tunnels were narrow, wet, and extraordinarily cold. The smell was overpowering. The water that actors waded through was not clean water specially pumped in for the production. It was real sewer water, with everything that implies. The crew wore boots and protective clothing, but nothing truly kept out the cold or the smell. Lights had to be rigged in extremely tight spaces. Camera operators crouched and squeezed through passages barely wide enough for a person. Every shot required enormous effort just to set up physically before a single frame was filmed. Orson Welles, who spent significant time filming in those tunnels during the chase sequence, was reportedly deeply unhappy about the conditions. He was a man who liked comfort, who appreciated fine food and warm surroundings. The Vienna sewers offered none of that, but his discomfort, his actual, genuine physical distress, may have contributed to something powerful in his performance. When Harry Lime runs through those tunnels, desperate, cornered, frightened, the fear feels utterly real. The sewer sequence is now one of the most celebrated chase scenes in the history of cinema. But the crew who filmed it remembered it less as a cinematic triumph and more as a long, cold, miserable, unforgettable ordeal. What looks thrilling on screen was pure exhaustion behind the camera. Number 14. Joseph Cotten was not the first choice. Joseph Cotten played Holly Martins, the American writer who arrives in Vienna to visit his old friend Harry Lime and finds himself tangled in a mystery he never expected. Cotten brought a kind of gentle, confused, almost endearing quality to the role. An American abroad who is always slightly behind everyone else, always almost understanding, but never quite catching up. It is a perfect performance for the story. But here is the surprising part. Joseph Cotten was not Carol Reed's original first choice for the role. Reed had considered several other actors before landing on Cotten. The role required someone who could project both likability and a certain kind of naivety, someone the audience would root for without fully respecting, someone slightly out of their depth in a world more complex than anything they had prepared for. Finding that exact quality in an actor is harder than it sounds. What made Cotten's eventual casting feel right was his history with Orson Welles. The two men had worked together on Citizen Kane in 1941 and on other projects through their years with the Mercury Theater. There was a genuine friendship between them, a real warmth and familiarity. And that history translated directly onto the screen. When Holly Martins talks about Harry Lime, when he defends him, misses him, then slowly realizes who Harry Lime truly is, the grief feels authentic, because underneath the acting there was a real relationship being echoed. The chemistry between two old friends playing two old friends created something that could not have been scripted. It had to be lived first. What looked like a fictional friendship had roots in a very real one. Number 13. The famous doorway scene was an accident. One of the most celebrated moments in The Third Man, perhaps one of the most celebrated single shots in all of cinema history, almost did not happen the way it did. The scene in question is Harry Lime's first appearance on screen. For almost an hour, the audience has heard about Harry Lime. Everyone speaks of him. He haunts the story without being present. And then, in a dark Viennese street, a cat rubs against a pair of shoes in a doorway. Holly Martins looks up. A light from a nearby window falls on a face. And there is Harry Lime, grinning, half in shadow, very much alive. According to accounts from the production, the light that illuminates Orson Welles' face in that moment was not entirely planned the way it appears. The specific combination of shadow and light, The way half his face glows and the other half disappears into darkness came together partly through the particular position of the practical light source and the angle at which the camera caught it. The crew recognized immediately that something extraordinary had happened in front of the lens. The result was left exactly as it was. Carol Reed, who had a brilliant eye for what worked and what did not, knew better than to interfere with a gift. The shot was kept. The grin stayed in shadow. And that single image, Orson Welles' face appearing out of darkness for the first time, became one of the defining images of cinema. Film historians write about it. Artists paint it. It has been referenced in dozens of films made in the decades since. A planned scene with an unplanned perfection. The camera caught something that could not have been rehearsed. What looked like careful direction was partly beautiful. Unrepeatable luck. Number 12. The script had a different ending. Graham Greene wrote the ending of The Third Man one way. Carol Reed filmed it a completely different way. And the argument between them, polite but firm, is one of the most interesting creative disagreements in film history. In Greene's original ending, as Holly Martins waits for Anna Schmidt after Harry Lime's funeral, she walks toward him. The suggestion is that life continues, that connection is possible, that even in a broken world, human beings reach toward each other. It is warmer, more hopeful. Carol Reed refused to film it that way. He wanted something colder, something more honest about what the story had actually been. In Reed's ending, the ending that appears in the film, Anna walks down a long tree-lined road toward the camera, and Holly stands to the side, watching, hopeful. She does not slow down. She does not look at him. She walks straight past him without a single glance and disappears out of frame. Holly just stands there. The film ends. It is one of the most emotionally devastating endings in cinema. The audience feels it physically. That long walk, that refusal to look, that silence. It says everything about what the story meant. Anna is not interested in Holly's redemption or his regret. She loved Harry Lime, and Harry Lime is gone. The world does not soften to make Holly feel better. It simply continues. Greene eventually admitted that Reed was right. The colder ending was the true ending. Some stories do not end with warmth. They end with truth. And sometimes truth is a woman walking down a road and not looking back. One creative decision changed everything about how the film felt. Number 11. 4 countries, 1 city, endless tension. Vienna in 1948 was not a free city. After World War II, the city had been divided into 4 zones, controlled separately by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. These 4 powers barely trusted each other. Tensions were high. The Cold War was just beginning to sharpen its edges. Moving through Vienna meant crossing through different zones of military control, showing papers, being watched, being questioned. It was an atmosphere full of suspicion, and nobody was entirely sure who was on which side. This political reality became the living heart of The Third Man. The story of black market crime, moral corruption, and broken loyalty made complete sense in a city where the normal rules of law and order had fractured into 4 competing versions of themselves. Carol Reed and Graham Greene understood that the political situation was not just background. It was the engine of the whole story. In a divided city, everyone has a different loyalty. Nobody tells the complete truth. and everyone is, in some way, trying to survive a system that does not quite work. The production itself felt some of this tension. Filming in the Soviet-controlled zone of Vienna required permissions and negotiations that were delicate and sometimes frustrating. Soviet officers occasionally observed the filming with suspicion. The crew was always aware that they were working in a city where the wrong conversation could cause real problems. Reed used this real-world anxiety to fuel the story. The paranoia on screen was not manufactured. It was borrowed from the streets where the cameras were standing. What looked like fiction was, in many ways, a documentary of a very specific moment in history. Number 10. Orson Welles wrote his own most famous line. There is a speech in The Third Man that has become one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue in the history of cinema. It takes place on a Ferris wheel in Vienna's Prater amusement park. Harry Lime looks down at the people below, tiny, distant, ant-like, and says something that is charming and monstrous at the same time. He compares centuries of Italian violence under the Borgias to the creativity it produced, painting, sculpture, art, and then compares Switzerland's 500 years of peace and brotherhood to the cuckoo clock. Graham Greene did not write that speech. Orson Welles did. Or at least, that is what Welles always claimed, and most film historians tend to believe him, with some suggesting Greene may have contributed elements while Welles shaped the final version. Welles was known throughout his career for his ability to write dialogue that sounded both brilliant and naturally spoken, words that felt too clever to be accidental, but too effortless to seem constructed. The speech was added to the script after Greene's initial draft was complete. Welles felt that Harry Lime needed one great moment where his worldview became clear, not just suggested, but stated. A moment where the audience understood exactly what kind of mind they were dealing with. The Ferris wheel speech is that moment. It is the speech of a man who has made peace with his own evil, who has built a philosophy around it, who finds the whole situation faintly amusing. It is one of cinema's great pieces of writing. And it was written by the actor who performed it, standing on a Ferris wheel in Vienna, in a coat that was slightly too large, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. That wasn't just acting. That was a man writing his own legend. Number 9. The film was nearly shot. In black and white by accident. The Third Man is filmed in black and white, and the photography is extraordinary. The deep shadows, the brilliant highlights, the way light catches a wet cobblestone or bleeds through a broken window. All of it feels deliberate, precise, and almost painterly. The cinematographer responsible for this visual world was Robert Krasker, an Australian-British cameraman who had already worked on several important British films. But what most people do not know is how unconventional his methods were, and how much resistance he faced in using them. Krasker pushed the contrast in his images far beyond what was considered normal or safe for the time. He deliberately underexposed certain shots to create deeper, more dramatic shadows. He used lighting setups that other cameramen found extreme or risky. He shot at night in real locations with minimal artificial light, relying instead on street lamps, window glow, and the natural reflection of wet stone. The results were images that looked nothing like the typical British films of that era. They looked dangerous, unstable, alive. Some of the production team worried that the footage would be too dark, too unusual, too strange for audiences to accept. There were conversations about whether Krasker's approach was too experimental. But Carol Reed trusted his cameraman completely and defended his methods whenever they were questioned. When The Third Man was released, Robert Krasker won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography. His work on the film is still taught as one of the finest examples of black and white filmmaking in cinema history. What looked risky in the darkroom looked like genius on the screen. Number 8. The Cat belonged to Orson Welles. Do you remember the cat that appears in Harry Lime's first scene? The small, curious animal that rubs against a pair of shoes at a darkened doorway, drawing Holly Martin's eye upward to reveal Harry Lime for the first time? That cat plays a tiny but absolutely essential role in the film. Without it, the scene loses its magic. The cat is what causes Holly to look up. The cat is what leads the audience's eye directly to Orson Welles' face appearing in the light. That cat is arguably one of the most important animals in movie history. According to stories from the production, the cat took an immediate liking to Orson Welles on set. Animals, as any filmmaker will tell you, are almost impossible to direct. They do not understand marks or blocking or what the camera needs. Getting an animal to perform a specific action at a specific moment requires enormous patience and frequently enormous luck. But this particular cat seemed to genuinely enjoy Welles's company. It approached him naturally. It rubbed against his shoes without any obvious encouragement. The crew used this real behavior. They encouraged it. They waited for the cat to do what it seemed to want to do anyway, be close to Orson Welles. And the result was one of the most natural, unforced moments in the film. The cat's affection for the actor became the device that revealed the character. It was not scripted in any precise mechanical sense. It was observed and captured. Even the animals felt Orson Welles' gravity. What looked like a perfect directorial decision was, in truth, a happy collaboration between a great actor and a very friendly cat. Number 7. Alida Valli was a risk that paid off. The role of Anna Schmidt, the woman who loved Harry Lime and refuses to betray him even after learning what he truly was, required a very specific kind of actress. She needed to be beautiful, certainly, but more than beautiful. She needed to carry a kind of immovable sadness, a loyalty so deep it bordered on something irrational, a quality that made the audience feel the weight of her grief even when she said almost nothing. Carol Reed found that quality in Alida Valli, an Italian actress who was relatively unknown to British and American audiences at the time. Choosing Valli was considered a risk by the studio. Selznick International, the American production partner on the film, wanted a more recognizable face, someone whose name would sell tickets. There were suggestions that a bigger Hollywood star should be cast in the role. Reed pushed back. He wanted Valli. He believed she could carry the emotional truth of the character in a way that a more famous, more polished actress might not. Valli had actually spent part of the war years in difficult circumstances, and there was something in her face, in her eyes particularly, that held genuine experience, not performed sadness, real weight, real history. When Anna Schmidt looks at Holly Martins and refuses to forgive him for what he did to Harry Lime, you believe her completely. You feel her refusal as a physical thing. The final image of the film, Anna walking past Holly without looking at him, belongs entirely to Valli's performance. It is silent, it is simple, and it breaks the heart. What the studio saw as a risk, the audience felt as the absolute truth. Number 6. The film was not a hit everywhere. At first, it might be hard to believe today when The Third Man appears on nearly every list of the greatest films ever made, but when it was first released, the response was not universally enthusiastic. In Britain, where it opened in September of 1949, the film was a major success. Critics praised it warmly. Audiences responded to its atmosphere and mystery. The zither music became famous almost immediately. Everything seemed to confirm that Reed and his team had made something special. But in the United States, the reaction was more complicated. American audiences in 1949 were not always comfortable with films that were morally ambiguous, stories where nobody was entirely good, where justice came at an enormous personal cost, where the ending left you feeling unsettled rather than satisfied. David O. Selznick, who distributed the film in America, made changes to the version released there. He added a different voiceover narration at the start of the film, spoken by Joseph Cotton's character, which some felt changed the tone. He also cut several minutes from the film. Critics in America were respectful but somewhat cooler than their British counterparts. The film won the top prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 1949, the Palme d'Or, which was a monumental recognition. It was also nominated for multiple Academy Awards. But the American theatrical run was quieter than the British one. Over the decades that followed, appreciation for the film grew steadily and powerfully. What began as a moderate success in one country became, across time, a global masterpiece. Some films take a while to arrive at their true destination. What looked like a mixed reception was really just the world catching up. Number 5. Carol Reed, directed in Secretly Uncomfortable Conditions. Carol Reed was known throughout his career for being meticulous, patient, and deeply committed to getting exactly the image he wanted. He would wait for the right light. He would adjust a single detail in a frame for a very long time. He was not the kind of director who said, "good enough," and moved on. He wanted perfect. And during the making of The Third Man, that commitment was tested in ways that went far beyond normal filmmaking difficulty. Reed was filming on real Viennese streets, in winter at night, in bombed-out areas of the city that offered no protection from the cold. The production operated in genuinely extreme conditions. The crew was cold. The equipment sometimes froze or became difficult to operate. Lighting had to be rigged in areas that provided no convenient infrastructure. Everything was harder than it would have been in a studio. Everything took longer. And yet, Reed maintained the same precise, patient approach he would have used on the most comfortable studio set in London. He was known for speaking quietly to actors, for creating an atmosphere of calm even when everything around him was difficult. He made people feel that the work was manageable, even when the conditions were miserable. Actors who worked with Reed often described him as a director who made them feel safe, who communicated trust and confidence without demanding or pressuring. In an environment as physically challenging as The Third Man's production, that leadership quality was essential. The crew followed Reed through cold nights and dark tunnels because he gave them a reason to believe it was worth it. What looked effortless on screen cost enormous effort behind it. Number 4. The film predicted the Cold War. Before it had a name, The Third Man was released in 1949. The phrase Cold War had only recently entered common use. The division of Europe into East and West was still taking shape. The Iron Curtain, the invisible wall between Soviet-controlled countries and the democratic West, was only just becoming the defining reality of international life. Most people were still trying to understand what the world after World War II was going to look like. And into this uncertain moment, the third man arrived. The film did not use the words Cold War. It did not lecture the audience about political ideology. But everything about it breathed the atmosphere of that new, cold, suspicious world. A city divided into zones of competing power. Laws that did not quite apply everywhere equally. People who moved between loyalties who could not be trusted to be exactly who they appeared. A black market that thrived in the gaps between legitimate authority. A moral landscape where even the heroes were compromised. Graham Greene had a deep understanding of how political systems could corrupt individuals. It was a theme he had explored in his novels for years. Carol Reed had an eye for the visual language of anxiety and moral confusion. Together they made a film that captured the spirit of the early Cold War with remarkable precision, not by describing it, but by living inside it. Film historians later recognized The Third Man as one of the earliest and most effective examples of Cold War cinema. It described a world that audiences were already living in, using a story that made that world visible and emotionally comprehensible. The fiction was, in many ways, more truthful than the news. One story about one dead man said more about the age than 1,000 headlines. Number 3. The film saved a famous Ferris wheel. The Riesenrad, the giant Ferris wheel in Vienna's Prater amusement park, had been standing since 1897. It was a beloved landmark of the city, a symbol of Viennese life across generations. But by the end of World War II, it was in extremely poor condition. The war had damaged parts of it. The city had more urgent priorities than restoring an old amusement ride. There were serious discussions about whether the Riesenrad should simply be taken down. Carol Reed chose to film the famous Ferris wheel scene, the scene where Harry Lime delivers his most memorable speech, on the Riesenrad itself. The production required the wheel to be operational for filming. This meant that necessary restoration work had to be done to make it function safely. Money and attention went into the structure that might not otherwise have arrived so quickly or so effectively. The film's use of the Riesenrad gave the wheel a new identity. Suddenly, it was not just an old, damaged amusement park attraction. It was the location of one of cinema's most iconic scenes. Tourists who saw the film wanted to visit it. The scene was so powerful, so specifically attached to that particular wheel, that the Riesenrad became inseparable from the film in the public imagination. Today, the Riesenrad still stands. It still turns. And inside one of its cabins, there is a small museum dedicated to its history. And The Third Man is prominently featured in that history. A film saved an old wheel from being forgotten, and that old wheel gave the film one of its greatest moments. What looked like a location choice turned into an act of preservation. Number 2. The film that defined an era for British cinema. By the time The Third Man was released in 1949, British cinema was working hard to define itself. Hollywood dominated the global film market. American movies were bigger, louder, and had more money behind them. British filmmakers were constantly being asked, sometimes directly, sometimes by the market itself, whether they should simply try to be more like Hollywood, make bigger stories, use more glamour, aim for broader, simpler entertainment. The Third Man was a direct and confident answer to that question. It said, no, British cinema would be something different. It would go to real locations. It would embrace moral complexity. It would use shadows instead of spotlights. It would trust the audience to feel discomfort and call it art. It would not explain its ending. It would not comfort you. The film became a defining example of what British post-war cinema could achieve. It showed that restraint could be more powerful than spectacle. That atmosphere could carry a story as effectively as action. That a film could be deeply uncomfortable and deeply beloved at the same time. Directors who came after Reed, British and international alike, studied The Third Man and learned from it. The influence of the film can be felt in spy thrillers, noir cinema, European art films, and American independent films made in the decades that followed. Its DNA is embedded in cinema history in a way that few individual films can claim. One British film made on damaged streets with a small budget and enormous artistry quietly became a blueprint for serious filmmaking. What looked like one director's personal vision became a shared language for generations of filmmakers. Number 1. The Third Man, ranked among the greatest films ever made, and almost was not made at all. Here is the most remarkable fact of all. The Third Man, the film that sits at the very top of almost every serious list of British cinema's greatest achievements, the film that the British Film Institute once named the greatest British film ever made, very nearly did not get made. The combination of people, conditions, and creative decisions that produced this particular film was extraordinarily unlikely. Remove any single element, and everything falls apart. If Carol Reed had not walked into that Viennese cafe and heard Anton Ferris playing his zither, the music would have been different, and the whole emotional character of the film would have shifted. If Graham Greene had not had that one sentence written on the back of an envelope, the story would not exist. If Orson Welles had arrived on schedule instead of late, the dynamic on set might have been entirely different. If Robert Krasker had played it safe with his camera instead of pushing into experimental darkness, the visual language that defines the film would never have been born. If Carol Reed had given in on the ending, if he had let Anna turn and look at Holly, the film's emotional truth would have been softened into something smaller and less honest. Every single major element of The Third Man arrived through a combination of deliberate choice and unexpected fortune. It is the kind of film that could only have been made at that exact moment, in that exact city, with those exact people, under those exact circumstances. It cannot be remade. It cannot be improved. It simply exists in the way that certain things exist, completely, perfectly, and irreplaceably. The film has been seen by millions of people across more than 70 years. It has made people feel less alone in a complicated world. It has shown that corruption and beauty can exist in the same frame, in the same city, in the same human being. And it started with a sentence on the back of an envelope, a cafe musician's fingers on a zither, and a director who tilted his camera because the world was not straight. What almost did not exist became everything. Bonus fact: the lost scene that haunts film historians. There is a scene that was filmed for The Third Man that most audiences have never seen and may never see in its complete form. During the production, Carol Reed shot additional material, conversations, transitional moments, small character scenes that did not make it into the final edit. This was not unusual. Film productions generate more footage than any final cut can contain, and editors make difficult choices about what stays and what goes. What is unusual about The Third Man's lost material is the particular story surrounding one specific sequence involving a conversation between Holly Martins and a Viennese official that was filmed, but then removed from all known versions of the film. The reasons for its removal were partly practical. The film was already nearly 100 minutes long, and the scene slowed the pace at a point where momentum was essential. But there were also suggestions, according to accounts from crew members who worked on the production, that the scene contained dialogue that was politically sensitive given the divided city's atmosphere. Vienna in 1948 was not a place where you wanted to put certain things permanently on film if you were planning to distribute that film in multiple countries, some of which had very specific political sensitivities. Film preservationists have spent years researching the complete original footage from The Third Man's production. Some materials are held in archives in Britain. Others are less accessible. The idea that there exists somewhere additional footage of Orson Welles as Harry Lime, of Joseph Cotten navigating Vienna's divided streets, of the city of ruins being captured by Robert Krasker's extraordinary camera. That idea is both exciting and melancholy in equal measure. Carol Reed was known for protecting his creative vision fiercely, but also for being practical about what served the story and what did not. If he removed that scene, he removed it because the film was better without it. His judgment across more than 70 years of the film's existence has proven correct in every other creative decision he made. And yet, film historians continue to wonder. They continue to search. They continue to ask what those extra frames might reveal about a city, a story, and a moment in history that produced one of cinema's most enduring masterpieces. Some stories are told in what is shown. Others live in what was hidden. Old footage, unanswered questions. The mystery continues. The Third Man is not just a great film. It is a conversation about what it means to live in a broken world and still look for something worth believing in. It is about friendship that turns out to be built on lies, about loyalty that refuses to bend even when it probably should, about a city full of ruins that somehow still had music in it, a man in a cafe, fingers on strings, a melody that spun and did not resolve into comfort. Carol Reed went to Vienna with a camera and came back with something that has lasted longer than most buildings, most governments, and most certainties of the era in which it was made. He tilted his camera because the world was not straight. He let his actress walk past without looking back because the truth demanded it. He trusted a cafe musician because the music was true. Every choice in this film, the shadows, the angles, the silence, the cold sewer water, the cat in the doorway, came from people who cared deeply about telling the truth through a story, even a fictional one, especially a fictional one. And that is why, more than 70 years after it was made, people still watch The Third Man in the dark and feel something real. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.